All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Avgeriou. I'm a professor at the University of Groningen. I'm also one of the organizers of this school and your lecture for today. To be honest, I would have really wished that all of us are in Leiden right now and seeing each other in person. It's really a blast being there at the Lawrence Center. We have a lot of fun activities happening during the school, like a wine and cheese party or a boat tour. But okay, this year we'll have to do with a virtual version, and hopefully next year we can come back with a physical event. Having said that, today I'm here to talk to you about empirical research in the field of software architecture. So this is a topic that's very close to my heart. I've been doing this kind of research for a good part of the last 15 years. And I'm here to share my experience with you guys and maybe give you some good guidance and advice on how to design and conduct your studies. Please remember that during the lecture, you can keep some notes, and then we will get together at the school so that you can ask me some questions live. Okay, let's give it a go. If I manage to make my slides working, there you go. So when it comes to scientific research, when it comes to conducting research studies, there are basically two aspects that are the most important, and these are the rigor of the studies as well as the impact of the results. Yeah, the first one, the rigor, I'm sure you understand the significance here. It's basically how scientific we are when we are designing and running these studies, when we're doing data collection and data analysis. We want to be as scientific as possible, of course, so that the results are eventually as valid as possible. So the validity of the result should be as higher as possible. The second aspect is impact. So when we talk about impact, of course, we are aiming at helping software architects and software engineers. So the impact of our work is measured by how much we actually help software practitioners to do their job better, to solve problems in their everyday work, to make sure that we somehow help these folks to, do a better job in software development. And this is usually not something that is at the, let's say, top priority for most people that are doing academic research. So let me begin by telling you a little story. Once upon a time, in a land far, far away, doing scientific research, academic research was much easier. Things were more straightforward. The sun was brighter. Life was much happier overall. Why was that? Well, what you needed to do if you were doing a PhD, for example, was first to come up with a specific technology, a language, a tool, I don't know, a method, a meta model, and then you would write it up and you would argue about the goodness of this technology as a kind of, advocacy research. So you would have some argumentation, logical argumentation, to convince your reviewers that this is a cool thing, this is a good technology to be used in software engineering. And then, your reviewers would get this paper and they would say, okay, so this argument sounds sort of reasonable. Yeah, okay, maybe that's a good way to go. So, your paper might have gotten accepted just by bringing arguments to the table that what you're actually proposing is, a reasonable way to go. Well, I told you that this was a story from long ago and from a faraway land, but in fact, I lied to you. This did not happen very long ago or very far away from here. Um, it happened to me quite recently. I was a program chair for ISA. I'm sure you know ISA. It's the premium conference for software architecture. And part of my job was to determine the MIP, the most influential paper from ISA, which is the paper from 10 years ago that had the most influence. So me and my co-chair, we looked at the papers published at ISA or WIXA from 10 years ago in 2009, and we came up with 3 papers that were very highly cited, right? They had like 200 citations on Google Scholar. And we looked at those papers up close, and we found out that they basically had very little validation, maybe no validation. So we were kind of surprised that, even about 10, 11 years ago, our community was not producing very high quality evidence to convince the reviewers and, of course, the practitioners that their research actually has merit. And so I wanted to show you one of these papers and how it was done back then. I realized that if I showed you this paper, then I would basically insult one of my own colleagues, and then they would get very angry with me and I would be in real trouble. So instead, I decided to insult myself as a kind of self-trolling, if you like. So here's a paper that I produced when I was still a young and innocent assistant professor when I started here in Groningen about 2006, 2007. So a couple of PhD students and myself and another colleague, we were studying the problem of architecture knowledge vaporizing. I'm sure you know what this is. We know that design decisions and the rationale, for example, disappears. It's not written down, it just vanishes in thin air, and then we have trouble figuring out what happened there. So this was a known problem even back then, and me and my students said, well, here's a solution. We came up with a tool which was an Eclipse plugin. If you don't know what Eclipse is, maybe you're too young, but you can always Google it. And what our tool did was it was able to document architecture design decisions through a little language, an architecture description language that was actually embedded in Java source code. It was brilliant. I mean, we were such great pioneers back then. And we described how our tool works by going through a number of use cases, like here's how you document a decision, here's how you search for a decision, here's how you reuse a decision. Very nice. We explained the architecture of the tool. This was inside the Eclipse ecosystem, which was not very simple back then. It's rather complicated. And we illustrated how to use this thing through a chat application. So this is an example, right? We didn't actually implement this in the company. This was never tested with users. We never talked to architects or anything. That's basically all that we did. And we submitted it to WIXA, which is the predecessor of ISA, back in 2007. And here's the comments we received from the reviewers. First reviewer said, this is a well-written article, an overall good read. The reliance on use cases for architecture decisions makes for a cohesive read. Thanks, man. Really nice. Cheers. The second reviewer was sort of positive, not that much. He said, yeah, nice paper, good to read, tackling an interesting issue. What it is lacking, however, was any kind of empirical evidence or even thought experiment that capturing architectural decisions in this way will actually pay for itself. Yeah, okay, you got me there. You didn't do that. Sorry for that. However, the program chair of ISA, in his infinite wisdom, decided to accept our paper because, we're nice guys. We were proposing something rather novel. So he said, yeah, sure. Okay, let's go for it. So we got another paper published at WIXA, and I just checked, I think yesterday, this paper has today 176 citations on Google Scholar. Nice, right? Are we good or what? So this is what happened back then. You could actually, come up with a paper that it describes a good sort of novel idea, not really validated, but you could still get it accepted. And up until today, this is something that's really well cited. But are we actually doing ourselves any favor with this? The fact that we are proposing a solution to a problem without validating it, without testing with our target users, software architects, software engineers, whether they actually find any value in this kind of things. Now, let me go back to impact. So, I mean, for you guys that are doing a PhD right now, I know that all you want to do is basically, publish your papers and, finish your thesis and get on with your life, which is, quite reasonable. But have you ever thought about who is actually going to read those papers? Is anybody going to use your results? Are software engineers being helped by the results that you produce? Do you make their life, their job a bit easier with the results that you come up with? I think this is an interesting question to ask yourselves, and this is a debate in our community for quite a while with relation to the gap between academia and industry. So I'm a big advocate of research that has impact, research that is able to convince practitioners that this is the right way to go or not. I still remember these old commercials from the 1950s or something. This particular one was trying to convince people that drinking beer is good for them. It makes them stronger. I think today you wouldn't be able to get away with this kind of advertisement. And probably there have been now scientific studies that prove otherwise. But, it's not much different than what we should be doing. We should not just saying people, use my tool for software architecture. It's gonna make you stronger, a better architect. Well, why? What's the evidence that you have to provide this, to support this? Another way to look at it is, if you're going to a doctor and you have a number of symptoms, and then the doctor says, okay, I know what you have. You can take those pills here, this medicine, and it will make you fine. By the way, we've never actually tested this medicine on a human being or at all. But, the guy that made the medicine is a smart guy. So, it should work. You should just take it. Well, if you were the patient, would you actually take the pills, the medicine that has never been tested, validated, evaluated at all? I'm gonna guess you would not. So, in conclusion, I'm gonna reiterate the quote from W. Edwards Deming, who said, "In God we trust, all others bring data." So when we do scientific research, data rules. Data is the king. If you don't have data, I'm really sorry, but you don't have anything. You need evidence to actually convince both your peers, which is other researchers, people that are going to review your paper, but also convince practitioners that what you are proposing, what you found out, actually has some merit. And this brings us to the matter of empirical research. So if you look into the literature for empirical methods, you will come up with a soup of terms, such as the one I'm showing on the screen. And you probably have seen at least the basic ones. So you know what experiments are and case studies and simulations. But then if you dig a bit deeper, you'll find out that, people get a bit confused about things. So for example, some people think that surveys are not a research method, but an instrument for collecting data. Other people think that grounded theory, for example, is a method for analyzing data. It's not a research method. In both cases, they are wrong because both of these methods, both of these things that I said are actually research methods. So there is, I think, a bit of confusion, and published papers don't always report well what they use and what they follow. So at least today, I'm going to try to disambiguate a few of these things just to, form a basis of what constitutes empirical research. Some of the common mistakes I see in papers that are submitted or even published are the following. So some people say, well, we've done this case study of a travel agency. I don't know if you've ever worked in the area of SOA, service-oriented architecture. They always use travel agencies for some reason. Most of these things are not case studies as such. They are basically toy examples. They're like thought experiments that people say, okay, travel agency has these services and this is how they connect, but it's just, imaginative. It's not a real system. Other people would say, well, the proposed approach has been implemented into real-world case studies, and then you go ahead and see the paper, and they use illustrative examples. So again, not case studies, which I will explain what these are in a few slides, but they're just showing by way of example some kind of system that has been implemented. Other papers would mention by experimenting with practitioners, okay? And then you read the paper and you see that there's no experiment in the sense that they don't control variables, they don't have lab conditions. It's probably more case study-ish because it's not really a case study, but they've kind of mixed things up. It's certainly not an experiment when they say this thing. They usually don't do anything close to a double-blind controlled experiment. And a lot of times I see something like this, experimental data on scaling up an order of magnitude. For example, they try to see if a performance of something can scale up, and they call this an experiment, and then you look at it and it's a simulation. This is the most, all of the performance papers are usually on simulations, and yet for some reason everybody calls this an experiment. So we have a kind of, we don't have a good understanding as a community about what the different terms mean. And by using them in a wrong way, we're not doing ourselves a favor because we confuse both readers and also other researchers that are trying to use similar methods for similar purposes. So if you are not quite sure at this moment which is the right method for your own work, then I can tell you that there's no right or wrong method. Everything is fit for a purpose. So you have to figure out which method would actually fit the problem that you're trying to solve. Depending on the goal of your study, the research questions that you're asking, you can choose a research method that pertains to that goal or research question. It is important to justify your choice. So to say, well, in this case, we can not control variables. We cannot have lab conditions. So we are going to have a case study instead of having an experiment. It's really important to do this. Otherwise, people wonder why you chose this over another method. And it's also super important to report your study according to guidelines. There are reporting guidelines for every kind of study. And by using those guidelines, you actually do this in a standardized way so that reviewers can understand how the study has been designed and conducted, how you did data collection, data analysis, and they're much better able to assess it. It's also much easier to replicate a study that has been reported according to guidelines. So today, what I'm going to present is the big three. So these are experiments, case studies, and surveys. These are the three types of studies that are used by and large in the field of software architecture. And this is a little kind of explanation about how they compare against each other with respect to a number of criteria. Experiments are mostly quantitative. So usually we measure things. We measure independent variables and dependent variables, and we try to see cause and effect relations between them. Surveys are mostly quantitative. Usually we have a sample from the population and we measure, percentage of the population does this, another percentage does that. Case studies are mostly qualitative. So that's the big difference with the other two. In case studies, we usually have, we talk to people, we have qualitative rich data, and we try to find out what's usually happening with our object of study. Experiments are usually lab studies, also called in vitro. Surveys and case studies are field studies, also called in vivo. If you want to put it in different terms, experiments happen in labs. They happen in constrained environments so that you can control variables. Surveys and case studies happen in real life. So you do not actually control or constrain anything. Then you have the difference between positivism and constructivism. These are the two main, let's say, schools of thoughts when doing empirical research. Positivism, for positivism, you can think of physics, where you think that there is an absolute truth. I have this object, the object has gravity. If I let go, it's going to fall on the floor. So there is an absolute truth about this, and we can find this truth. Constructivism, think of, for example, sociology. Constructivism says that there's no absolute truth, but all truth is socially constructed. This means that it depends. So, you ask someone, do you like this car? And then they say, yep, it's a beautiful car. And then you ask another person and they say, this is the ugliest car I've seen. So both are correct, both say the truth, but the truth is socially constructed. So you need to find out in which cases what truth holds, if you like. So experiments are more on the positivist side. Case studies are most on the constructivist side, but there are also a lot of in-between cases. Surveys can usually be both. Experiments and surveys are fixed. It means that you do the study design and then you run the study according to this design. Case studies are more flexible. So you see how things are going. When you interview people, for example, you see their answers. If they say something interesting, then you follow up with a question. So you have a bit of flexibility on which direction to go. If you don't have enough data, you can always go back and collect more data. So you have more flexibility on how to do this. With respect to cost, well, none of them is really easy to do. Experiments are usually the more expensive because you have to do an almost perfect job in the study design. If you don't do that, maybe your data are not going to be worth anything and you have to throw it away. Case studies also have a medium to high cost. Surveys are usually slightly less effort intensive, but that also depends on the scale of the survey. So this cost estimates are not really, they should be taken with a grain of salt. And then how to replicate them. Experiments and surveys are a bit easier to replicate because you have very concrete steps to follow. Case studies, not so much, because again, they're a bit more flexible and they depend a lot of the context. So if you go to a different company to do a case study, there is a few things that you need to change in order to perform the case study. So replication is possible, but not as easy as in the other two cases. Okay, so let me start by going through the first type of study, and that's the case study. So in this case, a case study, I've used the word case too much in this sentence already. Case studies aim at investigating a contemporary phenomenon within its real-life context. So these two concepts, phenomenon and context, are the basic things in a case study. Think, for example, of a phenomenon like how architects make design decisions. So the way that they, think about the problem space, the way that they come up with alternative solutions, the way that they come up with a decision by choosing one of those solutions, this is the phenomenon. What's the context here? Usually it's the software development project where they work. So this is the trick, that in a case study, you're using a case study because the boundaries between the phenomenon and the context are not so clear. It's kind of hard to separate the two and study them apart. So if you were to study this thing, the decision-making of architects, you can do that within a software development project. But if you were to do it in the lab, by separating this from the software development project, it really becomes quite hard to do this separation. You can study the decision-making within the project, within the team, within the stakeholders of a project. But if you try to separate it, it really becomes cumbersome to do that. So that's why in a case study, you always have the phenomenon inside its context. And this is real life, in vivo. Again, we are studying things that are hard to study in isolation. We cannot control behavioral events, or we don't have to control behavioral events. For example, if you have people making design decisions, software architects make design decisions, you cannot tell them, look, I don't want you to think of this. I don't want you to use that. I want you to only focus and limit yourself. Usually, you cannot control these things, especially when it comes to complicated processes like decision making. So that's where it's pertinent to use a case study. Most of the times we have qualitative data, and this gives us usually rich sets of data. We are able to go into depth by having these rich data sets. It is possible to combine those qualitative data with quantitative ones, and this provides us with a better understanding of the problem, the phenomenon that we're trying to study. So for each one of the studies I will present, I will also give you a running example, so that for the specific type of study, we will give you some concrete instances of those details within our running example. So in this case, a running example is a paper we published a few years ago. We were studying the decision-making process of software architects. And by then, literature had established that decision-making is more of an art instead of a craft. So it's kind of ad hoc, not systematic. We had found out that architects are really not likely to document decisions. What they will do is mostly the so-called personalization. So they will get together in a coffee room or next to the water cooler, and they will start having a conversation where they share decisions. That's where most of the knowledge sharing happens. They cannot actually look up decisions in the system documentation. Now, in research, we had proposed a number of documentation tools, but we found out that these tools are not really meeting the expectations of industry. And that is a bit of a problem because it means that they're not going to get adopted and used by the envisioned users, which are software architects. So we said, okay, let's build a tool with the industry and for the industry. And we teamed up with a large company called ABB. And we work with the architects in this company to build a tool for them. And we wanted to find out how far architects would use our tool and why they would use it. So this was the main research goal of our study. Now, what kind of case studies exists? You can either have exploratory, confirmatory, descriptive, or improving case studies. Exploratory means that you're trying to figure out what's happening and also generate ideas and hypotheses. In empirical research, this is also called theory building. So you come up with a new theory, a set of hypotheses, a set of ideas, a model, a new theory that kind of explains how things happen in a certain phenomenon, the phenomenon that you're trying to study. Confirmatory case study is putting the above theory to a test. So once you have a theory, you can try to confirm it by a case study. A descriptive case study is also trying to find out what's happening in a specific phenomenon, but not really to generate theory. This is a bit more preliminary. So you're just trying to describe how a particular phenomenon works, what really happens there. And finally, the improving case study is when you try to improve some part of the phenomenon that you're studying. So, for example, that decision-making is a bit biased. So you're trying to say, okay, maybe, we can find a way to mitigate this bias to some extent. So in our running example, again, I remind you that we are trying to find out, we are building a tool that helps architects document decisions better. So the type that we had for our case study was confirmatory. We wanted to evaluate this tool and do that in a realistic context. This means within the company, in the actual daily work of the architects. We had limited control of variables, so we could not tell the architects what to do. The architects are very busy people. They have very important problems to solve, and they want to do it in their own way. So we had to just let them do their work and make sure that, we collect enough data in the end to be able to answer our research questions. Now, for a case study, you always have cases and units of analysis. What is the case? Case is the phenomenon. In the case study, we study a phenomenon in its context, so case is the phenomenon. This is usually a project. It could be a person, like an architect. It could be a team, a development team. And it could be a specific practice that is being used in an organization. Sometimes cases are too large, so we have to actually split them up to study them a bit better. So we split them up in the so-called units of analysis. So depending on the combination between cases and units of analysis, we distinguish between single cases and multiple cases, as well as between embedded cases and holistic cases. So just to give you an example here, this is purely illustrative. If you're studying one project in one company, then the case is the project and you have a holistic single case study. If you have two projects in two different companies, the context is different. So each company gives you a different context, but you still have two projects. So you have two cases. In this case, you would have a holistic multiple case study. So the case is the unit of analysis, but we have two different cases in two different contexts. If you have a single company, a single project, but two different architects. This means that the project is your case, but inside the project, you actually study two different architects. And then each one of those is a unit of analysis. So in this case, you have an embedded single case study. And finally, if you had, again, as an example, two companies, in each one, you have two projects, and each project has an architect. So in total, 4 architects. This is the more compartmentalized case study because you would have 2 different contexts, so 2 different companies. In each company, you also have 2 different projects, so 2 different cases. And in each project, you have 2 different architects, 2 different units of analysis. So that is an embedded multiple case study. What was the type in our case study in the running example? Well, we had a number of architects within ABB, our company, and these architects were working each on a different project. So we considered each architect to be an individual case. They were using our tool, the decision architect, to document their decision. And this means that we went with a holistic case study. Holistic case studies are good because they give you a broader perspective. They actually are able to shed light on the object of study in a more general sense. At the same time, the behavior and the perceptions of the architects that we were working with depend very much on their context. What's the context, the project they work on? These were projects on industrial automation, on the power grid. This company is actually involved in a lot of different application domains, completely different projects, completely different domains. The responsibilities of the architects changed a lot, and also their work attitude. So for us, for our study, what does this mean? That we actually had to have multiple cases, and each one of those cases, again, was a single architect. Having multiple cases allows you to have a kind of a replication because you're basically studying the same thing, but in a different context. And the advantage here is that you're able to compare eventually. You're able to say, okay, this thing and that thing are equal, but I can see also some differences in different levels. How do you select cases in a case study? You do that intentionally. So this is in contrast to surveys and experiments where you randomize as far as you can. In case studies, you want intentionality because you're studying either typical, critical, revelatory, or unique cases. This means that you are choosing, you're cherry picking what you want to study. Maybe it's a typical example, so you want to take it and generalize. Maybe it's a critical, something that only appears when a problem arises, so you're able to distinguish this case. Maybe it reveals something that you didn't know before, or maybe just unique. And those unique cases, those outliers, are also very interesting to study. So the advice is to choose a single case if your case is representative, and then it's, you can study something in a broad sense and you can try to generalize from that. Otherwise, you can go with a multiple case. This is a more robust design because you're actually studying a number of different cases. You're replicating in a number of different cases, and you're able to compare. This increases your external validity. And this means that you can generalize your results to a larger population. Now, we'll talk about external validity at the last part of this lecture, but external validity is usually the shortcoming of case studies. Usually, external validity of case studies is not the strongest point. You have to be very careful about where exactly and how you can generalize it. In our running example, the architects that we worked with in our study were already involved in a specific project. we made sure that they were all having the responsibilities of a software architect. So they were actually not just having a title in their, they did not have the word architect in their job title, but they were doing the things that architects are supposed to do. We tried to make sure that they all had considerable experience in software architecture, that they use Enterprise Architect. This is the tool where we developed our plugin for. And from those architects that satisfied all of these criteria, we invited them based on how available they were to take part in our study. Now, another important aspect of case studies is that they are able, or at least they should be able to link evidence. Remember that with case studies, we are studying phenomena in vivo, in real life. This means that usually we cannot derive conclusions with statistical significance. We cannot run statistical tests and say, okay, for our sample, we can reject this hypothesis or not. But what we are able to do is to find out how different sources of data, sources of evidence can link to each other. And this is really important because we're able to triangulate, we're able to confirm what we found from this data source with what we found in that data source. Just to show you what we did in our running example, we had 3 different research questions. This actually mapped to the so-called technology acceptance model. If you've heard of that, the technology acceptance model tries to figure out how useful a technology is, how easy it is to use it, as well as whether contextual factors like your organization, your experience, your project plays a role on how you are willing to adopt the technology. And we collected data using 5 different methods. We used documentation analysis, interviews, a focus group, questionnaire that was asking for the background of architects. And we also did a webinar and another questionnaire there. So we had 5 different data sources. And for each research question, we were able to collect data from at least 4 of those data sources. So we're actually able to link evidence from interviews with the documentation analysis, with the focus group, and so on. Again, this allows us to triangulate. This allows us to confirm that the evidence we found through this channel is also confirmed by that channel. And this gives us greater confidence in the validity of our results. Now, if you are curious about what the results of this running example is, very briefly, just to close the loop, these are the things that our architects said. Everything is targeted that is needed for a decision documentation. I don't have to use another tool for all my decisions. I can do it directly where I spend most of my design work. That's a really big effect for me. Sometimes it's enough to look at the relations to understand the rationale behind the decision. I would just create more documentation because I have this tool. So a lot of happy customers. This was a very successful study in this company. They actually liked our tool a lot, maybe because they helped us design and build it. But this was a case where we really, were able to say, okay, our end users, the software architects for this particular organization, are actually quite happy with what we are presenting them. Okay, I think before we move to the next one, I'm going to take a really short break here, just for you guys. Go out and stretch your legs and get some more coffee. And then I will continue with the other 2 types of studies in the next part of the lecture.